What if we shared all our seafood culturing secrets? Another way of thinking about this is what if we shared all our aquaculture secrets? But aquaculture can mean a lot of things. But let's start with the aquatic foods. So aquatic foods are actually really important to global food security. There are a lot of cultures and a lot of people that rely on seafood as traditional foods, cultural foods. They also make a lot of money. It's valued from that perspective as well. And in a commentary in a recent paper, recent magazine, there were 7 priorities to end hunger and protect the planet listed by a few authors. And one of the main priorities had to do with aquatic food systems. And here we have a picture from the article of a woman harvesting seaweed. She's a seaweed farmer in Bali, Indonesia. And sustaining aquatic foods is listed as one of their major priorities. And that they mentioned that a lot of focus has mostly been on soil-based agriculture, but fish, shellfish, aquatic plants, algae offer a lot, both nutritionally, they're very important nutritionally, and environmentally. They do a lot for the environment. They can sequester carbon, they can clean the water. A lot of shellfish are filter feeders. They can possibly reduce the amount of CO2 in the water, increasing acidification. So plants are really good at that, right? Because plants take in CO2 and water to make oxygen. And so they're really encouraging in this paper to sustain aquatic food systems because it's not only going to help feed everyone, but it's also going to help the environment long term. And the sustainability of these systems might possibly be really good, depending how we do it, right? And so knowing how to do these systems, to create systems that are sustainable requires research and experimentation, and sharing knowledge about this, sharing in your communities, assuming everyone is part of an aquaculturing community, how to do this in the best way that's great for everyone. But we live in a world, a society that's run by money. And so if we're good at making a product, let's say a certain kind of seaweed, a certain kind of oyster, we tend to, not always, but we tend to hold on to our secrets for as long as possible because we're worried that our competitors might outcompete us because we are in a very capitalistic system. And sometimes, but not always, there are subsidies for things like aquaculture, but it's not necessarily as common as, say, soil-based farming. But the price of keeping our culturing secrets can be detrimental to our very industry. Recently, I saw an article in a newsletter that I get, the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. And there's an article written by a hatchery manager or director of research and development at Mook Sea Farm, which is in Maine. And they had a problem this summer where their larvae in this hatchery kept having problems in terms of abnormal growth and dying. And it turned out that there was something in the water and weren't quite sure what it was, although they have their suspicions that was causing them problems. And they tried all these different kinds of things. And they knew that other hatcheries must have been having the same problems, but there wasn't necessarily a network or a way to communicate directly about all of it. And so while they did a lot of really great work to try to figure out what the problem is and mitigate it, at least for the season, because if they lose all their larvae, they lose all their money that year. They really need these larvae to survive. And those little D-shaped luminescent pancakes there in the middle of the page are the larvae I'm talking about. And so it's really important to figure out these problems. But because in the industry, people don't always share as much as they could, they really almost lost a lot of their product this season. And so this letter specifically calls for collaborating more, to share this kind of important information that not only affected this hatchery, but probably affected lots of others. And so working together would help solve the problem quicker. And in the environment that I'm in, I work at Roger Williams University, and I work in aquaculture and extension as part of my job. And extension is really about bridging the science from universities to the industry and the community. It's an example of how to share this information. We might do research on a project that an industry is really interested in. They might say, hey, we have this problem, can you help us? And so we maintain a bridge of connection that way. And this is actually based on land grant institutions, this kind of role and communication between universities and, say, aquaculture, coastal communities. Land grant universities had extension built in for agriculture. So the agriculture industry and the university and their research program would communicate back and forth. And these kinds of programs are really, really important. They produce really great research programs. This is a picture of Bill Watton at Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, who's a extension specialist, and he's on a aquaculture farm here looking at some gear in a wetsuit, just to give you an idea of some of the systems look like. And on that note, I kind of wanted to explain the diversity of what aquaculture is right now, and honestly, like what it could be beyond. And so some of the systems that are pretty common, on the left, you have the land-based recirculating aquaculture system, which is often used for fish. And so this is all on land, and there's usually water that's pumped in from some source. It might be fresh, it might be salty, and you have a feeding system, and you have an oxygen control, and you collect waste, and you go through all of this filtration and disinfection and degassing, biofiltration to keep the water clean and keep the fish happy and alive. And on the right side, I wanted to bring this up because aquaponics has become more popular, especially if you don't have access to a lot of water somewhere, but where you are growing essentially plants and fish together, and the nitrogen that the fish release in their waste is then used by the plants to grow, and it returns the water free of this nitrogen, because if there's too much nitrogen in the system, the fish will die. So it's this really nice balance where the fish produce the ammonia, and then it is converted to a form that the plants can use, and then they can grow. And this can be a really cool system depending on where you are, but these kinds of systems could increase more in the future. Going back to the sea though, here we have a diagram showing where you have a hatchery on shore. Like I mentioned earlier from the article I showed you, a hatchery where they grow the baby fish and they hatch out, right? And they get brought out to these bigger offshore cages. And in this case, we're talking about finfish. That's usually where that happens. And you can set up the cages at different depths, different types of cages, and they can be ideal for certain kinds of locations. And people like to put them out offshore sometimes to avoid causing too much waste from the fish to affect the nearby ecosystem or people. And then, of course, there's shellfish farming and seaweed farming. And this diagram shows you sort of a complementary system where you have both the shellfish and the seaweed next to each other, and the shellfish is cleaning up the water at different parts of the water column. And it can create habitat for other fish and species. I've seen this a lot, actually. You see a whole community of animals start to pop up around aquaculture farms. And then it can also help provide habitat, and the seaweed can provide habitat and also reduce the pH of the water, which is one of the effects of climate change. So there's all these really interesting ways that these systems can be set up in different places and can be adapted and changed for different goals in different environments. And there's so much that we can learn from experimenting more with these systems. And these all tie back to whether it's aquaculture or wild caught, it all ties back to creating provisions and food sources for people, which then get consumed. And they're all part of the system that's managed by governance structures, both public and private, in terms of how much is produced, how much is supported, what are the rules and regulations, and how we're all tied to these businesses and food production systems as a culture and as a group. And so one of the questions that I tend to think of, if we knew enough about all these aquaculture systems and all the research that we do, and we're able to ask all the questions and money wasn't an issue, could we achieve sustainable aquaculture food systems that last thousands of years without negatively impacting the environment? Could we do it with our local species instead of importing species that grow really fast or are really popular? Could we adapt long-term sustainable systems with what we have nearby and be happy with it and have a culture that thrives around it? And I go back to the Clam Garden project in British Columbia that I mentioned in one of my other talks, in the Salish Sea, and the people who live here and whose ancestors have lived here for thousands of years. And I think recently they found anthropological evidence that there were people in this part of the coast as early as like 10 or 13,000 years ago. So they've been here for a long time. And these pictures show the rock walls that have been created by people to create clam gardens. And what these rock walls do is, over time, they change the slope of the beach just above it. And so the slope of the beach and the water that comes in all is optimal for growing clams, and actually other animals as well in these little ecosystems. So they've changed these beaches in such a way that they are much better for harvesting clams and other traditional foods. They're much better for harvesting clams and other traditional foods. And this is part of a larger project, the Clam Garden Network, which involves researchers and tribes and Canadian government to reinvigorate, to restore a lot of these walls, and to reestablish these traditional food systems. And a lot of these walls have been around for over 3,000 years. So for thousands of years, these people created sustainable food systems that integrated really well with their environment and were very, very stable and fulfilling. So this is one of my favorite projects to talk about when we talk about sharing our knowledge of culturing systems of seafood and producing sustainable systems that really can make a culture thrive. So for my final questions for this presentation for you to think about, If you could participate in community aquaculture, what would your day look like? How would you engage with your community? And how might it shift your values, your personal values? How would your relationship with your environment change? And how would you measure the success of your aquaculture systems?